So good evening, everyone. My name is Mark Berry. I'm the president of Schoodic Institute at Acadia National Park. I'm going to be very brief this evening and just welcome all of you and then turn the floor over to Becky Colwill, who's the Chief of Resource Management for Acadia National Park, who has known our speaker this evening for far longer than I have, since I met him on Monday. And so Becky will give a proper introduction, and I'll just note that Schoodic Institute is a close partner to Acadia National Park on science and education, and particularly working to improve understanding and awareness of and appreciation for the natural world. And that we often are focused on understanding environmental change in that work. And with that, Becky.
So I told Dan I wouldn't say anything bad about him if he came and talked to us. Dr. Daniel Odess is the Chief Scientist for Cultural Resources for the National Park Service in Washington. And in that job, he sort of takes a kind of really global look at some of the issues related to cultural resources in the Park Service, and works on really complex issues involving science, management of cultural resources for the Park Service, and some of the large landscape and other kinds of initiatives that the Park Service is doing to lead in the field of thinking about how we manage for cultural resources nationally. His responsibility includes the Cultural Resource Climate Change Program and the cultural resources aspect of emergency preparedness and response to nationally significant disasters. And holy cow, let me tell you, he spent 5 years as the sort of the federal agent on the ground for the BP oil spill incident. So talking about working between the Army Corps of Engineers, the Coast Guard, the parishes of Louisiana, you name it, in terms of incredibly complex negotiations and working to protect cultural resources and to ensure that that disaster didn't totally annihilate the incredible significance of those resources there. So he kind of knows a little bit about how to manage some kind of issues, complex issues, and that's not what he's going to talk about tonight, but it gives you a little bit of background about some of the work that he does do for the Park Service. Dan's an archaeologist. Don't hold that against him, I don't. No, we're both archaeologists, and what that has brought to us is an appreciation for taking the long view, looking at the past and the complexity of the past to inform how we think about the present and the future. And that's a really valuable skill, and I'm glad that he's willing to talk about that now. Dan got his PhD at Brown University and went on to do, he's done field work mostly in the high Arctic, Russia, Canada, and Alaska primarily, as well as other places, and worked at the University of Alaska at Fairbanks for a while before we were lucky enough to see him come into the Park Service. So with that, dear friend, take it away.
Thank you, Becky. So good evening. Thanks for coming. I'm going to spend a little bit of time this evening with you talking about archaeology and climate change. You know, as a nation, I'm sure you're all aware of this, and that's probably partly why you're here. We really are facing some substantial challenges about what we should do to mitigate greenhouse gases as a way to slow climate change, but also what we need to do to respond, to adapt to climate change. I work for the National Park Service, but I want to make sure you're aware that I'm sort of off my leash tonight, and that means what I'm going to say isn't official Park Service position or opinion or anything like that. It's my own heresies. So if you hear the ravings of a madman this evening, it's my fault. Before I launch into this, I want to thank the Schoodic Institute and Mark Berry for your hospitality. Great facility. We've been treated very well over the last few days as we've been here. the National Park Service, Acadia National Park. Again, Abe, you've done a great job pulling together a really good program over the last couple of days. Becky, it's performance appraisal time. Be nice to Abe. And I want to thank Becky for the invitation to speak here. I don't often get to go talk about fun things. I get to talk about, heavy, dire things, serious things. And this could be heavy and dire and serious, but I think we'll try and take a little bit of a lighthearted look at things. And instead of focusing on the present and the future, where our decisions have great consequence, let's look at the past. And I should say, if you're unhappy about anything I have to say, if this talk isn't what you expected, it's performance appraisal time. Talk to Becky's boss, because it's her fault. So climate change, let me get the presentation going here. Magic. Okay. So climate change remains politically sensitive, in part because it evokes strong emotional reactions from people on all sides of the debate. And this is because it's scary. It's also because the decisions that confront us often have a very high price tag associated with them. If we are going to seriously stop emitting greenhouse gases, that's going to be expensive. We're going to have to really rethink how we use automobiles in this country. The coal industry has a lot at stake. The petroleum industry has a lot at stake. Everybody has a lot at stake, the American taxpayer. And I'm guessing that with one possible exception, you're all American taxpayers. So you have a lot at stake. How you live your life, the quality of life, our way of life is really at stake in those discussions. So I'm not going to talk about that. I'm not going to talk about whether climate change is real. I'm not going to talk about whether humans are the cause. Instead, we're going to turn our back on the future. We're going to turn our back on the present. And we're going to look at the past this evening. We're going to go back in time to the good old days when, at least in theory, things were a lot simpler and the choices that confronted people were fewer and farther between. In the process, I'll tell you a little bit about archaeology and some of the science that goes into archaeology to help us understand how past climates have affected people in the past. Part of my day job, or a good portion of my day job, involves helping the nation figure out how we're going to preserve cultural resources, historic resources. And particularly in an era of climate change, that can be challenging. The material manifestations of our collective history and heritage, archaeological sites, historic buildings, carriageways here in Acadia, that sort of thing. And yes, I would include in that traditional ways of life, which are very important along the Maine coast. All of those are threatened by droughts and fires and floods and sea level rise. And we are seeing the loss of significant resources already. Unfortunately, we're losing things even before we realize that they're there in some cases, because as a nation, we have not really invested the energy, the money that we need to figure out where everything is. We haven't invested the time needed to have those in-depth conversations with the public about what's important and why it's important and who it's important to. And that's kind of sad. But as I said, I'm not here to talk about the present or the future. We're fast approaching the 50th anniversary of the National Historic Preservation Act. That's a landmark piece of legislation that really kind of set the stage for how we in this country preserve historic properties and cultural resources. Both the legal mechanisms and the sort of underlying philosophy for for how and why we do that. So as I was thinking about that, I was also thinking about my own mortality because I was born right about the time that act was signed. So I'm coming up on the big 5-0 tomorrow. And I think the anniversary of the act is a couple weeks later. I'm sorry, I'm coming up on the big 5-0 a week from tomorrow. No, a year from tomorrow. And yeah, I am hoping for cake, I admit it. So we've got this big anniversary coming up. And so I was looking back at the act, and I was like, wow, you know, some of the language that is included in the preamble, it's just poetry. I mean, it's absolutely evocative of our history and our heritage and why it's important and how it contributes to and defines who we are and all that stuff. And it's pretty impressive. But I was also struck that one of the rationales that the National Historic Preservation Act includes for why we preserve cultural resources is because of the scientific information that they embody. In other words, what they can tell us about the past. And I thought, wow, that was a lot of foresight on the part of the people who wrote that act. Because as I'm sure you've all heard, if you don't know your history, you may be doomed to repeat it. And as I think back on some of my own history, I don't really want to repeat some parts of it. So what is this scientific information that cultural resources contain, that an archaeological site, for example, contains? What is it? How do we get at it? How is it useful? What does it all mean? That's some of what we're going to talk about tonight. It's not strictly an esoteric question that should be contemplated by people wearing tweed jackets and sitting in the ivory tower, because it really does have powerful lessons that I think we would do well to heed, or we will be doomed to repeat some of the mistakes of the past. And I think as we talk about some of what those lessons are tonight, I think you'll see what I mean, or at least I hope you do. And if you don't, I hope you'll pretend that you do. So how do people respond to the environment as it changes? How do they respond in the short term, that is, say, over a period of hours or days? And how do they respond in the longer term, over months and years and decades and generations? Archaeology is pretty good at figuring out those longer term things, that what went on in a particular hour or a particular day. We're not so good at that, but longer term things we're good at, and I'll talk about that a little bit. But first I want to bring your attention to a remarkable and remarkably distressing study that came out in the journal Science about 2 years ago. It's called Quantifying the Influence of Climate on Human Conflict. This was a study it's what we call a meta-study, a study of studies. This means that it pulled together the results of studies from all over the place, from all over the world, about 60 different studies covering everything from yesterday back to 10,000 years ago and everything in between. They got a hold of all of the data that were relevant that they could get their hands on. It's a very impressive piece of work. And what they found is this: when the temperature or precipitation variation exceeds normal by 1 standard deviation, so you have sort of your normal, wet, dry, hot, cold, but when you get anomalous variations that exceed that variability by 1 standard deviation, what do you think happens in terms of interpersonal violence? Yeah, Becky and I talked about this, so Becky, you got to be quiet. So Mark? Yeah, it goes up. Any police officer knows this, right? Hot night in New York City, not a great time to be out, because there's an increase in interpersonal violence. They defined interpersonal violence as assaults, rapes, murders, and also police use of force. So for every 1 standard deviation of variance above that normal range, they get about a 4% increase in interpersonal violence. Now, I know we have some climate science guys in the audience, or guys and gals in the audience. So how many standard deviations above that normal variance are we expected to see, say, around 2050, or between now and 2050? Anybody? Oh, I've got the climate science guys squirming in the front there. We're expecting to see 2 to 4. Depending on where you are in the world, if it's a really variable part of the world, it's got to change a lot more to get above that threshold. That's just statistics. But on average, globally, we're expecting 2 to 4 sigma increase in variability. So for interpersonal violence, that means 4% per sigma. You do the math. We're looking at 8 to 16% increase in interpersonal violence due to global warming, or due to climate change. That's a whole lot of unhappy. But the news gets worse, because they also looked at changes in intergroup violence. And for intergroup violence, a 1 sigma change in the variability, a 1 sigma increase in the variability of temperature, increased intergroup violence by 14%. 14%. And we're expecting 2 to 4 sigma increases. So 28 to 56% increases in intergroup violence as a result of climate change. That's remarkable. That's remarkably distressing. But that is important in that it can help us understand culture change in the past in response to climate change. We see periods of increased warfare. Cities become more fortified. We see evidence of trauma in the skeletons that we look at as archaeologists and that sort of thing. And all of this does in fact seem to play out. But I would suggest, and I don't want to dwell on the present or the future too much, but I would suggest that that's already happening in the world. And I would call your attention to the example of Yemen. The country of Yemen has been experiencing for a decade or so significantly warmer temperatures and less precipitation than has been the historical norm. They have an ongoing civil war, probably as a result of competition for resources. And that civil war, which I think one could argue has ultimately climate change as a driver, has further prevented the ability of people to practice agriculture. So it's too dry to grow things and people are shooting at you. And they are looking at a massive famine because of that. So, we think about climate change and its effects on human populations in fairly simplistic terms sometimes. There's a drought and so people can't grow food, but it's usually more complicated than that. And I think you can look at Yemen as a case study for that. As I said, we're not going to focus on the present or the future tonight. Archaeology offers us 3 very powerful perspectives as we contemplate the implications of climate change for human beings. The first of these, of course, is time depth. Archaeology allows us to look deep into the human past, back to a time before there was a written language, or at places where people just didn't keep good records. And as we know, Winners write the history. So one of the things that archaeology does is it provides some balance. It allows us to look not just at what people said or what they said happened, but we can look at the physical evidence to determine what really happened, and that can be very useful. The second powerful perspective archaeology gives us is that it allows us to look at change over time, and particularly at timescales that are beyond what one person would experience in their lifetime. It's really the only way of studying humans that allows that perspective. A sociologist can study people over a period of years even, a psychologist the same. But archaeology gives you the ability to look at swaths of time, whether it's a few years. So even though we can't look at an hour here, an hour there, we can look at what went on over a period of years. And that is very useful for climate change because we know intuitively that the effects of climate change today are going to play out over generations. So we can look at how those things have happened in the past, how climate change in the past has played out over generations. And archaeology is a great way to do that. And finally, archaeology allows us to look at broad geographic areas. One person would have a hard time, looking all across Asia at what's going on. But archaeology allows us to pull together, the dozens of studies that people have done, more and more data, and with the aid of computers, we're able to look at bigger and bigger data sets and more powerful analyses so that we can really look at what's going on across a continent at a given period in time and how that changes over time. We have a long history of being interested in how the environment has shaped human culture, human adaptation, and why not? I think, speaking personally, it's natural to stand in awe of someone 4,000 years ago who was able to make a living on the northern end of Greenland with nothing more than a few little tiny stone tools and a great big brain. And that great big brain is very important. And they didn't just make a living, they thrived, they flourished, they created rich artistic traditions. So they weren't just scraping by, they were really living richly. But it's very difficult to draw conclusions about how people living really on the edge of the world, in very small groups, living in skin tents all winter long. The effects of the environment on them had to have been profound, but it's difficult to draw lessons from those effects on our contemporary situation. We're too removed in time, in our economic adaptation and technology. It's just a bridge too far, if you will. So instead, I'm going to focus on some larger, more complicated societies, and these are going to be ones that I think you've all heard of, but you may not have thought of them in these terms. But first, let me tell you a little bit about archaeology. With the exception of Becky, I think you all have the good fortune not to be archaeologists. It's a great burden, and I'm glad you've been able to make more productive use of your lives. One of the things you should know about archaeologists is that we're shameless borrowers of other people's techniques and other people's data. We rely heavily on the things that geologists and chemists and ecologists discover, but we do more interesting things with their data than they themselves do. They often fail to understand the significance of the things they discover for understanding the human past because, well, they're focused on bugs and rocks and stuff like that. So that's where we come in. They do the work, we get the glory. Archaeologists are like weavers. We pull together these little bits of string, a little bit of geology, a little bit of ecology, and we weave a tapestry. And that tapestry is the story of the human past. We shamelessly grab a little thread here and a little thread there to do that. As archaeologists, we've looked to understand the myriad ways that people in the past have adapted. That is, how they've solved the challenges of making a living under the conditions that confront them. We consistently underestimate the ingenuity of our species. We've always done that as archaeologists, and it drives me crazy. We somehow just can't get it through our heads that that guy living in northern Greenland 4,000 years ago with a fully modern brain was capable of exploiting every single species of animal and fish and bird in the environment, even the fish that live in deep, deep water. Like, oh my God, how could they do that? Well, they had a modern brain, and they were hungry. We have often, I think, fallen into the trap of overly simplistic explanations of how climate affects culture, or how the environment affects culture. It got colder, so things changed. Or it got warmer, so things changed. Or my personal favorite, things changed, so it must have gotten warmer or colder. If you're a scientist, you would call that formulating a hypothesis. If you're not a scientist, and even if you are a scientist, you weren't always a scientist, so you know what I'm about to say, and that is that really we call that making stuff up, that just-so story. And those can be elegant in their simplicity, but they're often pretty naive. And so we need to focus on, what's causing change? What are the driving mechanisms? It didn't just get colder. How did that affect things? What's the linkage between that change in temperature and the changes we see on the ground or in the archaeological record? That study I referenced earlier about changes in rates of interpersonal violence is really important for understanding that. And since I only ran into that study a couple days ago, I'm still digesting that, but I think it's really significant. So let's take a look at our case studies. Let's go back in time. Let's start with the year 1206. Probably doesn't seem terribly significant to anybody, but it will in a minute. The period from 1206 to 1227 in the current era is the period during which a rapid expansion of Mongols, under the man that Westerners call Genghis Khan, resulted in the largest contiguous land empire in the history of the world. That's the Mongol Empire at its height. And yes, I love German maps. Sorry, it was the best image I could find. But that's the Mongol Empire at its height. I would add that Japan was a vassal state. Down into here was also a vassal state. So in addition to the territory that they controlled directly, they had a heck of a lot of influence over an even bigger area. So just in terms of the land that they controlled, 22% of the Earth's surface was part of the Mongol Empire. We haven't seen anything like it before or since. At its height, it extended from the tropical jungles of Southeast Asia to the taiga of Siberia, from the Pacific to the Atlantic, or to the Mediterranean at least, from northern India, all across Europe, or across much of Europe. And it left a very recognizable genetic imprint on the people of Asia and on the people of Europe. For the past several decades, archaeologists and historians interested in the effects of climate on the rise and fall of civilizations have explained the Mongol Empire in those sort of mechanistic terms that I was talking about earlier. It got, in this case, the idea was it got drier, therefore the Mongol Empire. I mean, that's not really satisfactory to my way of thinking. It doesn't explain anything. Maybe it describes things, but in fact, it doesn't even describe things. So they were drawing on data from the Tibetan Plateau and north-central China. So Mongolia, Tibetan Plateau, long way in between them. Northern China, Tibetan Plateau, long way in between them. I'm sorry, Mongolian Plateau, long way in between them. And the climatic records from those areas indeed do say there was a drought. It got drier, it got hotter. Therefore, people thought, oh, maybe maybe the Mongols had a hard time finding enough for their horses to eat, so they had to expand. Yeah, that must be it. Well, it turns out they were completely wrong. The geographic homeland of the Mongols is some distance from the Tibetan Plateau and from north-central China. And the climate on the Mongolian Plateau is often out of sync with that in those other areas. Recently, some work has been done, and they published a couple of tree rings that were found. Tree rings are really handy things because as they're laid down annually. You all know that. You've seen trees that are cut down, and you can look at the stump and count the rings and figure out how old the tree is. What you might not have known is that when it is warmer and wetter, trees grow faster, and the ring is a little fatter. And when it's colder and drier, the tree grows more slowly, and the ring is a little narrower. And so a tree ring, or a tree ring record, not only allows you to count back very precisely in time year by year, but also to see what the environment was doing in terms of temperature and precipitation at any given year in that sequence. And that's pretty cool. So it turns out, as I said, that that whole idea that it got drier and therefore the Mongol horde, exploded out of Mongolia and took over the world, that's just flat out wrong. It was warmer and it was wetter in Mongolia in the decades preceding the rise of Genghis Khan before he ascended to the position of Khan. And that meant that the Mongols' horses were fat and happy and producing lots of foals, and those foals were living to be adult horses. And in all likelihood, the Mongols themselves were having more babies that made it to adulthood. So they were having probably unprecedented population growth. However, that story about the environment in the surrounding areas is correct. Their neighbors were suffering. Their neighbors were undergoing a drought. Their neighbors' horses were probably suffering. Their neighbors probably weren't having as many babies, or if they were having the same number of babies, those babies probably were not living to adulthood. And this brings us to that whole question of interpersonal and intergroup violence. A shrewd observer, and I think we can all agree that Genghis Khan was a shrewd observer, if nothing else, would have realized just how vulnerable these neighboring peoples were, particularly because he had lots of young men and lots of horses. And so they perpetrated some intergroup violence. They perpetrated a whole bunch of it. In the process, within 2 generations, they had toppled Chinese dynasties. They had made a vassal of Japan. They had swept west to control Eastern and Central Europe, conquered Persia and northern India, etc. The rest, as we say, is history. So what are the key takeaways from the story of the Mongol horde, the Golden Horde, the Mongol Empire, and climate change? I think there are a couple of lessons I would draw from that. One is that in the past, climate change has created winners and it's created losers. It's doing so now, and it will do so in the future. Its effects vary across space, and that variability matters a lot. And we're still struggling to understand how that variability will play out over space over the next, say, 30 to 50 years. Another lesson I think I would take from that is that we should be like Genghis Khan. We need to be bold, and we need to look for the opportunities that these changes are creating. Now, I'm not saying we should invade California because they're under a drought, but there will be opportunities that climate change presents. It will not be only bad news. I spent a lot of my life living in Fairbanks, Alaska. I know a lot of people are like, why would you do that? And in 1990, that was a legitimate question because I could not grow tomatoes in Fairbanks in 1990, and I love tomatoes. But with climate change, the growing season has expanded by more than 30 days in Fairbanks, and you can now grow tomatoes. And I'm living in Washington, D.C. So climate change will create opportunities. It will create winners and losers. Here in Maine, you're sort of on the northern end of things. Your growing season has expanded dramatically over the last 20 years, and it's likely to continue to do so. So there will be some additional agricultural opportunities that may not be fully realized yet. So those are some opportunities to think about. So let's shift our focus now from Eurasia to Southern Asia, Southeast Asia. And in particular to what is now Cambodia, the region that was home to the Khmer Empire from about 802 in the current era to 1431, so a little before Columbus sailed the ocean blue and all of that. You may have some kind of broad familiarity with European history, and you can kind of think about what was going on in Europe during this period. And the answer, at least for the first part, that, around the year 802, not a whole lot. We'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. But 802 to 1431 is the period of the Khmer Empire. And Angkor Wat, which you're looking at, a small fraction of Angkor Wat, was the capital. It was both a religious and an administrative center for an empire that included what is now Cambodia, Thailand, Laos, and southern Vietnam. At its peak, Angkor Wat was the largest city in the world. It covered roughly 1,000 square kilometers. For you Americans in the audience, that's about 390 square miles. An area about the size of modern Los Angeles. Some scholars believe that for about a 200-year period, beginning around the year 1000, Angkor Wat housed roughly 1 million people. If they're correct, and some people say more, some people say less, so it's probably not a bad guess. 1 million people, give or take 100,000 people, something like that. In any event, about 1 in every 1,000 people on the face of the earth in the year 1000 lived in Angkor Wat. That's kind of cool. There aren't any cities like that today. There aren't any cities that are anywhere close to that number, mostly because there are a lot more people. But that's a whole lot of people to be living long before we harnessed electricity or had diesel engines or big pumps to move water around or things like that. Angkor Wat is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and justifiably so. It's really remarkable. So what was the basis of their economy? How does it relate to climate and climate change? What became of that empire? And how does that relate to climate change? So the Khmer Empire was founded on a highly productive irrigation system. Irrigation agriculture made possible by more or less regular rains that were part of a tropical monsoon. There were extensive roads, numerous man-made reservoirs, and a highly sophisticated system of canals that could both capture water during periods of heavy rain to prevent flooding, as well as distribute that water to people to use and irrigate their fields during dry periods. So they lived in an area that was already very good for agriculture. But importantly, they further enhanced that area's productivity. And you've got to grow a lot of food to feed 1 million people. So they further enhanced its productivity and made it more resilient in the face of fluctuations in the environment by capturing and storing and managing water. It was a remarkable combination of technology, infrastructure, and administration. And as a Washington bureaucrat, I want to, wave the flag for administration. Things worked pretty well. This place survived and thrived for 600 years. I remember when I was about 10 years old, we had our bicentennial, 200 years, woohoo. Well, we got a ways to go to get to 600 years. So, I kind of stand in awe of their ability to keep this thing going for 600 years. They had extensive trade relationships with China and India and Sri Lanka. They didn't get along very well with the people to the west, and that's a good thing. I think most groups of any size, if they're going to persist for any period of time more than a few months, they need some sort of external rallying point to focus on. Whether it's the town where I grew up in upstate New York, our rallying point was the football team from the next town up the road. Those people from Salem. But it's the same thing with nationalism. Leaders will beat the drum of nationalism to point out what's wrong with those godforsaken savages who live on the other side of the mountain, and to instill loyalty among their populace and unity among their populace. Happens today. It's probably happened for years and years. Like the Mongols to their north, the Khmer Empire was a remarkable administrative accomplishment, and like the Mongolian Empire, it was far from immune from strife, particularly at times of transition from one leader to the next. A state of perpetual hostility existed with the kingdoms to the west. But interestingly, the Khmer Empire began as a Hindu empire. It's not that they had Hinduism as a state religion, but they were Hindu. There were a lot of Buddhists living in the empire. Doesn't seem to have been a big deal. And in fact, at one point in time, they kind of shifted over to being a Buddhist nation because one of the leaders who became the leader was a Buddhist, and he decided, okay, we're going to be Buddhists. So they did some pretty serious re-architecting on the monumental architecture to give it more of a Buddhist cast. But there doesn't seem to have been a lot of civil strife that accompanied that. And ultimately, the empire reverted back to Hinduism. Again, not a whole lot of civil strife. And again, some of the buildings got reworked to make them represent the Hindu pantheon a little bit. Now, might seem odd that I'm talking about this sort of ebb and flow of different religions within this kingdom in the context of a talk about climate change. But for a long time, that was used as the explanation for what kind of started going wrong with Angkor Wat. Who got blamed for what went wrong was, kind of in the eye of the beholder. Hindu scholars talked about it being a problem that it began to happen among the Buddhists when the Buddhists were in charge, and the Buddhists said, no, it was the Hindus. The idea, I think the dominant idea was that because the very nature of Buddhism is that you don't have revered leaders. There may be spiritual leaders, but you don't have revered political leaders. And the thinking was that the reduction in the grandeur of the king, if you will, resulted in kind of an administrative goofing off. People weren't as attentive, and they stopped maintaining those hydraulic systems, those canals, those reservoirs. And as evidence of this, because if you're going to have a good story, it helps to have some evidence. They said, look, if you look in those canals, there's some silt and some sand, and so my story's true. Well, it turns out not so much. There is, in fact, very strong evidence that climate and climatic stability, which played a role in the rise of Angkor Wat, persistence of Angkor Wat, the success of Angkor Wat, also played a central role in its demise. As I said, Angkor Wat was constructed to mitigate that kind of regular variability that came with the summer monsoon, periods of wetter and drier, but not too much wetter and not too much drier. It kind of went along within certain parameters, certain amplitude. And the fact that it persisted for 6 centuries is really a testament to how well it was working. It's no coincidence that this occurred during a period of relative stability. So once again, the hero of the story, the tree ring, the lowly tree ring, contains some really important information. And there are actually 2 different tree rings which were reported. And what they show is a period of decades-long weak summer monsoons characterized by drought. So if you're a climate person, you've looked at lots of these diagrams, but let me help you out here. This is PDSI, is the Palmer Drought Severity Index. That's all I'm going to say about it because I don't know a whole lot about it. But it's a way of characterizing how severe a drought is. So when this is up, it's wet. When this is down, it's dry. And you can see here the first of those prolonged dry periods, followed by a nice wet period, everything's okay, and then it got dry again. These tree ring data are further confirmed by stable isotope data taken both from speleothems found in caves in southern China and speleothems found in western India. These episodes show clear correlation with El Niño, La Niña events. You've all heard of those. They're critically important to the weather in the United States, particularly the western United States. Except that the correlation is negative. So what that means is it's kind of the inverse of what goes on in North America. El Niño tends to dampen the monsoon in Southeast Asia and bring drought, whereas La Niña tends to bring the rain. And there's It's a little more complicated than that. It depends on where sea surface temperature warms in the Pacific and all of that. But just as sort of a big picture view of things, that's kind of what's going on. So Angkor Wat had seen environmental variations before, and that's clearly indicated here. Wet, dry, wet, dry, wet, dry, wet, dry. But the amplitude and duration of the variation that is reflected in this tree ring signal, where those two red bars are, really exceeds that had occurred any time in the prior 600 years. The reservoirs simply did not hold sufficient water to supply the rice paddies and the needs of the population unless there was sufficient rain falling often enough to recharge the reservoirs, flow through the canals, et cetera, et cetera. So they appear to have been capable of buffering droughts that lasted a few years, but nothing on the order of a decade. So as the drought persisted, crops failed, and the populations began to disperse from Angkor Wat. Now, I noted that the amplitude of the variations was greater than at any time that had occurred during the previous 600 years. Droughts were more intense, they lasted longer. But, and this is important, I used to say that to my students, I'd say, and this is important, and they quickly start writing because it might be on the test. There won't be a test, so you don't have to write this down. But this is important. It also appears that the intervening episodes, so within those dry periods, there were a few real spikes of rain. Very, very wet episodes in the middle of droughts. And you all know, if it's very dry and you get a heavy rain, the water doesn't really sink in, it washes off, and you get a lot of erosion. It doesn't do your agriculture a whole lot of good, and in fact, it can cause a lot of damage. So, as I said, there'd been people who said, "Oh, there's some sediment in the canals, and that's evidence that when things were run by the Buddhists, the administration was breaking down." But they never actually did two important things. One, they never dated those sediments. There was an assumption, and this is why they were able to have it both ways. Oh, it was those Buddhists. No, it was those Hindus. There was an assumption that they knew when those sediments were deposited. And there was an assumption that that deposition was gradual. In fact, what they find when they actually look at the sediments, and these sediments are deep in places. In places they're a couple meters deep. And they were all deposited in a single event. A massive, high-energy flood event in the middle of a drought. That event clogged the canals, clogged the reservoirs, made it impossible to open or close the gates that controlled where the water went, and in fact made it impossible for the water to even get into the system. And that effectively sealed the doom of Angkor Wat, or at least its ability to sustain a population that at that time was probably somewhat less than 1 million, but still had an awful lot of people. There may have been even more to the story. Sometime, and this is a really hard one to date, but at least we're saying, gosh, we need to figure out when this happened. But sometime around, either during these very extreme erosive depositional events or shortly after, the Siem Reap River, which is the main river near Angkor Wat, actually cut a channel that's about 8 meters lower than the historic Angkor ground surface. So it actually cut down below the level that would have allowed people to draw water from that river to fill the canals and reservoirs. So that may have happened as part of that massive erosive event with some downcutting, or it may have happened subsequently, but in any event, this uptick in climatic variability that exceeded the design parameters for this canal and reservoir system sealed the fate of Angkor Wat. So what does Angkor Wat have to tell us about the present, about the future? First, Angkor Wat was intentionally designed to increase the resilience of people and the society that flourished there by buffering the effects of environmental variability on their agricultural practices. It did so using a sophisticated infrastructure designed to operate within certain design parameters. Sounds kind of like engineering speak, I know. But it clearly was a very well-engineered system to allow them to persist for so long. Are there parallels in the modern world? Can you think of places where infrastructure is used to buffer the effects of environmental variability today? Of course you can. Cities and towns that rely on levees to keep the river in the river. Charleston, South Carolina, sound familiar? New Orleans, sound familiar? Are there municipalities that use reservoirs for drinking and other water that count on a certain level of precipitation to maintain that drinking water supply? Of course there are. Are there entire states whose agricultural economy is dependent on drawing water from an aquifer when the rains don't provide enough water for plants? Of course. I could probably stand up here all night naming examples, but you could probably stand up here in my place all night and also name examples. We, as a species, are adapted through technology, using our big brains, to environmental parameters that exist within certain ranges. We've built our systems to those specifications, and yet we're looking at a time that's fast approaching when those environmental parameters are going to exceed the specifications that we've built to. So as I was writing this paper, preparing my talk, I was struck by the debate surrounding various federal efforts to make the nation more resilient to climate change. There's an executive order out. Some of you may have heard of it. It's number 136090. And what it does is talk about a federal flood risk management standard to which all new federal investments must adhere. In other words, the federal government's not going to provide money to build in the floodplain. That's kind of a gross description of it. But where exactly that floodplain is, how high it is, if you think about it as a ring in a bathtub, how high up the sides of the bathtub is what much of the discussion has been about. There's been a lot of discussion about this because there's a lot of money at stake. And the principal objection to following that standard that I've heard is it would be too expensive. How ironic. How sadly ironic that is. So archaeology is very good at figuring out what people did and ate and how they lived, but we're less adept at figuring out what people thought and believed and what they said in the past. Fortunately, we have imagination. I'm not saying, I would write this in a scholarly journal paper or anything like that, But just as a thought exercise, you can kind of imagine it's been awful dry in Angkor Wat, and people are talking. And the conversations is, you got the government guy, you've got the administrator from Angkor Wat. You want to raise the canal walls by 5 feet? Really? That's crazy. It'll cost a fortune. The canals have always worked so well in the past. Don't you know there's a drought on? Taxes are already too high. We just can't afford to make those changes. We need to study it more. So let's take a look at our third and final case study. There's been a lot of attention, and if you're visually impaired, we're going to talk about Vikings. There's been a lot of attention paid to the environmental conditions that allowed the Vikings to colonize Greenland and what ultimately became of their settlements there. But for our purposes this evening, and thinking about what the past has to say about the future, the colonization of Greenland is hugely interesting to me. It's something I've studied in great detail, and I'm reluctantly not going to talk a whole lot about it tonight, though I'd happily sit and talk for hours about it. And that is because Greenland is at the edge of the world again. It's maybe not the best place to draw lessons from for the modern age. In the year 793, history records horrible things happening. The records that survive from churches in England describe dragons and demons in the sky, whole series of other horrible indications of God's displeasure, blah, 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 blah. The most dramatic of which is the sacking of an important monastery on an English island called Lindisfarne. Those are the guys who did it. It wasn't Kirk Douglas. It wasn't Ernest Borgnine, but it could have been. This English monastery that had been inviolate, it had no defensive works, it had no soldiers, it had no armed people. It just had a bunch of monks, and a bunch of monks with a bunch of stuff. And it's likely that the that the Vikings were aware of England. They didn't just stumble upon it and go, oh my goodness, an undefended monastery. It must be Christmas. But for some reason, they attacked, pillaged, and burned it. And they put most of the monks to the sword. They left, probably intentionally, just a couple alive to tell the tale. Why did they do this? Beginning around that time, Europe was beginning to see warming. Environmental conditions were improving so that agriculture could improve. Areas that had been marginal or even off limits to agriculture could begin to be farmed. And we see all over Europe, for the first time in several centuries, the population increasing. The amount of land in Europe that is forested was cut, if you'll pardon the pun, in half in a period of a few hundred years. The medieval warm period was a very good time if you made a living as a farmer, except for the Viking raids, which were kind of a bummer. But for farmers in Scandinavia, the news wasn't quite as good. And that is because even with that warming, you really couldn't go up into the mountains very far and farm. You really couldn't go much further north and farm. They were really kind of right at the limits of what land they could exploit for agriculture. And so they had some increases in productivity and as a result increases in population. But their ability to expand the acres under cultivation was really limited. In contrast to people to the south who just had to cut down some more trees. And so they had a couple of other options that they were able to pursue. They headed west. They colonized Iceland. They fairly quickly partitioned out all the usable farmland in Iceland and proceeded to overgraze it. I don't know if you could attribute this to warming. I think the Vikings were violent people to begin with. Certainly look like violent people to me. That whole don't run with scissors thing seems to have eluded them. But for whatever reason, this guy named Eric, after killing his neighbor, and I think the translation that I like from the sagas says, and various others, he was banished. And he and his sons headed further west and established a colony in Greenland. So this strategy of bring more and more land under cultivation meant colonize Iceland. Maybe there wasn't anybody there. There might have been a few Irish monks, but these guys looked like they could handle a few Irish monks. They probably didn't encounter anybody in Greenland, at least not initially. So they had another strategy available to them, and that was colonize land that other people already had, take over. And they did that. They sailed down to Orkney and Shetland and the Faroe Isles, and then down into Scotland, and then they started invading England, and pretty quickly they had established control over significant amounts of England. But they didn't stop there. So that's their homeland. We know, this is an interesting digression, and I know we're running a little bit long, but another line of evidence that archaeologists use, because as I said, we're kind of shameless about borrowing data from everybody else. This is kind of the limit of where the Vikings could farm, because at their heart, they were farmers. They couldn't really go any further here because there were other feisty people to the south who objected to them. But they had farmed the margins of Scandinavia to the extent that those margins could be farmed. And we know that a couple thousand years ago, so maybe 1,200 years before the Viking Age, people had farmed further up, briefly, for maybe 200 years. We know this because there's a little bit of archaeological evidence, but as I said, we're shameless about borrowing data from other people. And there's evidence from looking at the bogs in those areas of an increase in paleofecal samples that come from humans. Apparently, human feces has a distinctive signature chemically that allows them to recognize, basically to say, oh my goodness, there's a bunch of people who are going to the bathroom. And we also see a shift from woodlands to more open grasslands, along with a lot of charcoal in the bogs that suggest there was active burning and cutting of the forests to create areas where animals could graze. So, if you're wondering how these paleofecal samples came to be, that's the explanation. Shortly after colonization occurred, it got colder again. The population of agricultural people in that area crashed, and that was the last time anybody was growing crops up there until very recently. Climate change may present an opportunity for them to do so again. The Vikings did not content themselves with England. They followed all those little red arrows you see on the map. They went everywhere. Through a combination of raiding and trading. They really didn't tend to take and hold territory in these sort of far-removed areas. They briefly took and held a little bit of northern Italy, Sicily. They took a bunch of France. But what they would often do instead was either sack a city and run off with everything portable of any value, sometimes burn it to the ground. Again, that very conscious effort to instill terror. Same thing that prompted them to leave a couple of monks alive at Lindisfarne. They took a lot of territory in France, or what is today France, and they would basically show up at the city gate and say, for a small consideration, a small donation to their retirement fund, they would go away peacefully and leave your city intact, and if you don't provide that, we'll burn it to the ground. And they did that over and over and over again, very successfully, until the Franks, ancestors of the modern French, actually said, we will give you a big chunk of territory if you'll just leave us alone. And you've got to become Christians. And when they did, the Norse or the Vikings very sensibly said, that sounds like a pretty good deal to me. And so Normandy, the area of Normandy in France, Norse or Northmandy, land of the Norsemen, is named for the Vikings because that whole area was given to the Vikings in exchange for them agreeing to, one, become Christian, and two, stop burning our cities down. So, what do we make of the Vikings? They used terror. The stories of the things they did are gruesome, shocking, intentionally designed to instill terror in the populace. Not, I would suggest, unlike the videos of the Islamic State beheading hostages. Interesting parallels there. They had a religion and ideology that made them remarkably effective. And in brief, their belief was the very best way to die is to die in battle. Dying in battle would assure you that you would go to Valhalla, which was the place to be. It was drinking with your friends. It was fighting in battles, which is great fun. through all eternity. So if you're going into battle and your mindset is, the worst thing that'll happen to me is I'm going to go to a really good place and have a great party for all eternity, or I'm going to win this fight. That's a really tough person to be up against, and I think that's what people all across this geography found. These people were fearless, they were aggressive, remarkably effective. So the lessons that the Vikings have to offer us are maybe not as clear-cut. In Greenland, we used to think they were just poorly adapted, and when things turned colder, they died and disappeared. And we know today that, in fact, that isn't the case. When things got colder, they abandoned the outlying farms in more marginal areas and kind of moved into the centers. Farms got larger, owned by one person and worked by many. But they persisted for a couple hundred years after the climate really kind of went south, or went north, I guess you could say. So that sort of cautionary tale of, it got cold, they couldn't adapt, they kept trying to grow crops where you couldn't grow crops, doesn't really hold up to the data. They started eating a lot of seals, trapping and hunting, and they were dwindling, but it wasn't, like climate knocked them over the head and that was it. But the lesson that I see in this is that improving climate, warming in this case, again, created opportunities and constraints, and how they responded to it is the key to this story. They made opportunity out of adversity. They were not in the best agricultural land in Europe. In fact, they were in some of the worst. Their opportunities for bringing more acreage under cultivation were very limited. They'd already cut down a lot of the forests in areas that could have been farmed. Couldn't go north because it was just getting colder as you went north. They couldn't go inland because it was the mountains. Heading west wasn't a great idea because, well, it was in the water. So instead, they just invaded. They very systematically captured the productivity of the soil, not with a plow, but with a sword or the axe. They took agricultural products and the wealth, portable wealth that those agricultural products had been converted into all across this area as plunder. And so while everyone else was busy trying to figure out how to improve their farming, Vikings had a different approach to adapting. So maybe the lesson we should draw from that is the need to think outside of the box, be creative, adapt like a Viking, something like that. So, any questions? Abe?
Did you see any evidence of the economic cost of those adaptations, like taking those opportunities?
In which case?
You mentioned the irony that we use cost. And clearly there is a cost of adaptation, right? Our systems are set up for the current conditions. To change is expensive. Or at least has some costs. Do you see evidence of those costs?
So, never underestimate the importance of PR. So let's think about what it would take to kind of sell people on things under each of these three scenarios. So for the Mongols, your options for gaining wealth and prestige are limited, and the competition is fiercer than ever because there's a bunch of young guys just like you, and they've got a cool horse too. And I'd like to enroll you in the idea of tackling these people over here who, they're having a hard time of it. We could probably knock them off pretty easily. And then you just say, yeah, I bet you couldn't do that. And you turn your 17-year-old horde loose on them. I'll bet you can't do that, and turn them loose. And away they go. Is that what happened? I really don't know. In the case of Angkor Wat, this is a really interesting situation because I think what happened was that PR piece was enrolling people in the idea that, if we work together, think of this as like, how does a system like this get going? If we work together, let's build a pond and maybe a little canal to capture some water from the river. And that way, later in the year when it's dry, we can take the water from that pond and we can water these 3 fields over here. And then other people see that. Like, wow, those guys their rice is looking pretty good. What's the secret? This was a very productive area even before that canal and reservoir system. It was prone to some risk from drought and flood. And I think the advantages of constructing such a system, maybe not on that scale initially, but those advantages would have been self-evident. I don't think that would have been a difficult sell. The challenge there, the cost, if you will, in that adaptation, is you need specialists to manage it. You need to support that bureaucracy. There's been some speculation, and I'm not a Southeast Asian specialist by any means, but I read occasionally. There's been some speculation that there were as many as 300,000 people in Angkor Wat who were devoted either to maintaining that monumental architecture that I showed the picture of, so that the maintenance staff, if you will, or to maintaining the canal and reservoir system. So a lot of you are either Park Service or friends of the Park Service or have visited a park, and the maintenance operations are critical. And in a system like that, they're huge. So there's an investment. There's an ongoing cost. And the benefit, I would argue, needs to outweigh that cost. Maybe not in a dollar and cents sense, but people have to feel like it's worth that investment. In the case of the Vikings, what's the cost? A lot of people got killed. Looking at the Vikings from the perch of the 21st century, where we are not accustomed to death. We don't see dead people. We don't see people die very often. And we certainly don't have an ideology in this country that the best way to die is while you're trying to kill someone else. So I think cost is relative, and cost is very much in the eye of the beholder. We can look at the numbers of Vikings who died, say in the Battle of Hastings, or trying to take Paris, or any number of other things, and think of that as a tremendous cost. I'm not sure they would view it in the same way. I don't think their calculus was the same. There was, I think, a mismatch in how they calculated that cost and how their adversaries calculated that cost, which is an interesting thing to think about in terms of how effective each side was. Does that kind of get at your question? Anyone else? All right, well, thank you.